I want to thank the Mainline School Night, which has been cooperating to promote today's event, and welcome their members here as well this afternoon. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors and hosts today, the Villanova University School of Business, as well as Villanova's Center for Business Analytics, Center for Global Leadership, and Center for Church Management and Business Ethics. With that, I'd like to welcome to the podium Dr. Patrick Majidi, who is the Helen and William O'Toole Dean at Villanova School of Business. Dr. Majidi is also Associate Professor of Strategic Management and Entrepreneurship and the Director of the Center for Innovation, Creativity, and Entrepreneurship at the Villanova School of Business. Patrick.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you all. Well, it is indeed my honor and privilege to welcome all of you to Villanova University. On behalf of Father Peter Donahue, our president, and in particular the Villanova School of Business, is really excited today to be participating in this event, and we are just thrilled to be partnering with the World Affairs Council and to provide a location outside the city to bring this fine council and our university together. As Craig mentioned, I would like to thank our Center for Global Leadership in particular, who I know has partnered with the council, in particular Kim Cahill and Jonathan Doe, who lead the center, and I'd also thank Joan Russell, who's been a part of this uniting of our two organizations. Villanova, I guess, I would never miss an opportunity to plug Villanova a little bit, especially the Villanova School of Business. Right in our backyard here regionally, we're very proud of the Villanova School of Business. It's been a top 25 business school for the last 10 years, and we have a special community here of outstanding scholars like Jonathan Doe and others that are here, but our student body is unrivaled, and the experience that our students get at Villanova is something that we think is special, and we're very proud that we have reached this level of national significance. And so I'd like to point that out, because sometimes in all things we don't realize what is in our backyard, and we are very proud to be one of the top business schools in the country. I'm particularly excited today to welcome Mr. Laszlo Bock for joining us this afternoon. This is exciting for us as a business school in particular. Mr. Bock leads Google's people function. He's responsible for attracting, developing, retaining, and delighting Googlers. So according to his book, he believes that giving people freedom and supplementing our instincts with hard science are steps on the path to making work meaningful and people happy. And my PhD is in management, strategic management, but we know that job satisfaction and what people think about their jobs and the person and the fit to the job are the strongest predictors of retention, of the types of outcomes that we all seek in our organization. So this is very important work and information that he is sharing with us. During Mr. Bock's tenure, Google has been named the best company to work for more than 30 times around the world and has received over 100 awards as an employer of choice. In 2010, he was named Human Resources Executive of the Year by HR Executive Magazine. He's the author of today's featured book, Work Rules: Insights from Inside Google to Transform How You Live and Lead, which has been named one of the top 15 business books of 2015. And all of you are receiving a copy of that. I know his hand was sore from signing some of them prior to this reception behind me. So it truly is a pleasure. Welcome to Villanova. Thank you all for being here, and thank you very much. Welcome to Mr. Laszlo Bock.
Well, thanks all for having me. Please don't stop eating. Somebody should at least be having lunch here, even if it's not me. It's a delight to be here for a couple reasons. I want to thank the World Affairs Council and Villanova, because I think this notion of debate and discussion and having people from different perspectives is so important. And we were chatting earlier about how the mission is to be apolitical and encourage debate and argument. And it's funny because at Google, that's the way we make decisions. We make decisions by what I call, I didn't coin the phrase, but what appears to me to be almost a Hegelian dialectic, where you sort of have someone take one position, someone take the opposite, and you argue like hell until you get to truth, right? So thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So it's fantastic to be here in support of an institution that has a similar philosophy. So thanks for that. I should also share, I learned two things already just from having all the conversations with you on the way in. One is that folks from Philadelphia are really nice. Like and I don't want to point fingers, and I don't know if this is going to be recorded or broadcast, but I just came from Manhattan. And the people here are really nice, so, you know, I might stick around. The second is, since you mentioned signing books, I discovered that I owe my thanks to all of you with really firm handshakes, because it's like a little massage every time after I sign it. So thank you, those of you who played football and baseball and were able to crush my hand just a little bit. The reason I wrote the book, and I was asked just to make a few comments, and then we'll have a conversation, is because Google's from the outside, looks like this amazing, perfect place to work. From the inside, it's like any place else. There's stuff that doesn't work well, stuff that's broken, stuff that's frustrating. But on the whole, it's not bad. It's pretty good. And I've had a lot of jobs in my career, ranging from kind of waiting tables to working as a lifeguard to working at a small company, working at a big one, being in consulting, being in nonprofit. I've kind of had more jobs than any one person should have by my age. And I realized we spend more time working than we do anything else. You know, nobody works a 40-hour week anymore. So if you add up the hours you actually spend doing your work, it's often more time than you spend sleeping, which is crazy. It's more time than you spend on your favorite hobbies or activities. It's actually even more time, way more time than you spend with the people you love more than anything. And for many people, far too many people, work is just a means to an end. It's a way to make a buck, and it's not pleasant and it's not fun. And what I've been lucky enough to see and be a part of at Google, and in doing the research for the book, getting to know other companies as well, is that it doesn't have to be that way at a whole lot of places. So, you know, Wegmans is a grocery chain a lot of folks have probably heard of. Completely different industry, right? Family-owned business versus publicly held company. Slow growth versus fast growth. People join straight out of high school, even if they've even finished high school. We hire a bunch of PhDs. We have 30% margins. They have 1% margins. They believe almost all the same things we do about how to treat people. And it comes from this fundamental idea that if you believe people are good, you're going to treat them well and be honest and open with them, and everything else flows from that. So what I hope to share is a little bit about our philosophy and how it works in other places, and also some of the science and data we put behind it. Because part of the challenge is people who've looked at people issues for years and years and years. The only people who apply any math to it are the ones who are at places like Villanova, where they actually do the analytics and prove what works and what doesn't. And practitioners often manage by gut. And one of the bones I have to pick is that your gut is almost always wrong. And so you should rely on some science and facts. So I'm looking forward to the debate, the discussion, and really grateful to be here. Thank you.
Please. So thanks for that overview. I want to kind of move through some of the key concepts in the book that people have not yet had a chance to read, and then expand to some other questions outside the book as well. So let me start with your statement that that companies should take power away from managers and empower employees. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and some examples of where you think that works?
Yeah, so the problem is, as a manager, what do you want from your teams? And actually, your mouths are full, so you don't have to answer. But if anybody has their mouths not full, what do you want from your teams if you're a manager? What do you want them to deliver for you? Anybody? Productivity, results? Because what was that? Passion. Because if they don't deliver, what was that? Innovation. Because if they don't deliver that, what happens to you? You get fired. If you're an employee, which all of us are, what do you want from your manager? Support, motivation.
But I think both ways. You want, if there are problems out there, you want your employees to come to you with what those problems are, propose solutions, and not feel like they'll have their head chopped off.
Absolutely. You want your employees to come to you if they have solutions, not get their head chopped off. So what you want as a manager is actually very different from what you want as an employee. As an employee, you want support, coaching, someone to clear bottlenecks, someone to listen, somebody to be there when you need it, but kind of stay out of your way the rest of the time because you were hired to do a job. When you're a manager, what you want is results and outcomes and delivering performance, and you also want people motivated somehow while you're managing them tightly. The reality is, as a manager, there's all these incentives which cause you to manage your people really, really tightly because you're on the hook for the results. And the problem is that causes really bad behavior. It causes your employees to want to kiss up to you and skew their results, It causes your employees, when you need to give them harsh feedback, to be defensive and argue about why you're wrong, rather than just say, that's a great point, thank you for the lesson. And it causes you to get less information about what's going on, because to the gentleman's point, people are only going to bring you the good stuff. They're not going to bring you the bad stuff. So at Google, we take power away from managers as much as we can. If you're a manager at Google, you're not allowed to make a hiring decision. You're not allowed to make a promotion decision. You can make a recommendation about pay, but that gets reviewed by other folks, including by my team. So we strip all this away from managers because we want to break this relationship where the manager controls and is the boss, and the employee is sort of subordinate and has to do what they're told. And we want to unlock this conversation. And so far, it's worked all right for us. But it's something that I write about, but I deeply believe. You want to strip power away from managers because the natural incentives of giving people power and authority is that it's like Lord Acton wrote hundreds of years ago. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and management's no different.
You talk in the book about the worst employees of a company being perhaps the greatest opportunity of the company. Can you explain further how that gets put into practice?
Yeah, well, so we front load our investment in people at Google. We focus intensely on recruiting and setting a very high bar for the people who come in, and we can talk about that if you wish. But the idea is we'd rather pass over a candidate that might be good than risk hiring a candidate that might be bad. So we avoid what are called false positives. We just would rather pass on that person because the effect of a bad person is immense, really, really bad. I see heads nodding already. So back to the question. If you're doing that right, and you've hired a bunch of people and you've assessed them sort of rigorously and objectively, what typically happens, and what we certainly see, is that when you have poor performers, it's not because they're idiots, and it's not because they're bad people. It's typically because we put them in the wrong job, or they've selected into the wrong job. What you typically see is when someone applies to your company, they don't know your company that well. They may have been a marketing person or salesperson for years, but within your culture, with your client base, it can be very, very different. Boris Groysberg of Harvard University writes about the importance of cultural context and fit. And so if you put somebody, what we found is most of our poor performers, our bottom 5%, are actually just in the wrong jobs. And when we have them, first we try to get them improved. That works about a third of the time. The rest of the time, we ask them to switch jobs, and 80% of the time, their performance reverts to mean, which means they go from being, third percentile in the company to maybe 48th percentile or 53rd, which is a huge performance improvement. And it's because we then do a better job of matching the person to the actual job than when they came in.
There are many provocative things in the book, but maybe the most provocative is the notion that it is not always fair or right to pay people the same amounts in the same job. Explain.
Yeah, so I think on the face of this, if I tell you people doing the same job sometimes should make 200% as much as the next person, or 300%, or 10 times more than the next person, that feels a little wrong, right? Like, it's weird to think somebody's making $50,000, but there could be somebody else in a similar job making $300,000. We actually see some of these differences. Your very best people are way better than we think they are, and they're way more in the company than we think they are typically. So when people look at LeBron James and see how his performance is so much better than average than other basketball players, people kind of go like, well, yeah, okay, that's fine. He's an amazing basketball player, and he makes way more than average. Everyone kind of says, yeah, well, that's basketball. These two academics, O'Boyle and O'Grenis, who looked at human performance across a variety of fields. And what they found is that human performance doesn't follow a normal distribution where you have, like most HR people will say, 10% are great, 10% are bad, 80% are sort of the unwashed middle. What they found instead is that it's more of a curve where you've got a whole bunch of people who are kind of average, and then you've got way more than 1 or 2 or 5 or 10% people who are exceptional. And they are way more productive. And people used to write about the 80-20 rule and things like that. What we see at Google is that a single good engineer can generate 200, 300 times more value than an average engineer. And we don't see quite as wide a range as when we look at sales people or finance people, but it's way wider than a 10 or 20% difference. And most HR systems, most management systems, they say, well, pay your people within, salaries have to be within 10 or 20%, and bonuses might be 50% difference from one person to another. They have to be way, way, way wider, because what happens in organizations is, if you look at the evidence, you see people perform way better and at a higher level than you actually expect based on sort of a traditional model. And unless you pay those people proportionately, and I don't mean dollar for everything they achieve, because the company helps, the team helps, but unless you really overpay them massively relative to everything else you're doing, for average people, your very best people have this huge incentive to quit. Because there's a labor market, and they can call another company, and your best people can do that and get massive increases in pay. And then you're stuck with what's left. And so the rational thing is actually to massively overpay your best people, and you've got more of them than you think you do.
You also talk a lot about transparency within the organization. I'd like you to talk about that, but also link it to the pay issue. So if the two people are sitting next to each other, does everybody know that the one next to them is making 10 times as much?
So they don't. So we're transparent, but there's a good reason. We tend to be very, very transparent in the company with how the business operates and access to sort of, all the secrets. So for example, if you're an engineer and you join, on day one you get access to 95 to 99% of Google's code base. So you can join and you can look up exactly how Google Search works, right? Or Google Ads products or Google Maps, and you can just see all the code. You can quit the next day and go to a competitor. But people don't, because we believe that if you believe people are good, like ethically, morally good people, you should trust them. And if you trust them, of course you would give them access to all your sort of proprietary secrets. And we find, by and large, people are good, and they do the right thing. Every quarter, our chairman, Eric Schmidt, we have our board meeting every quarter, and at the end of the meeting, the next week, he does an all-hands presentation with the entire company, and he shows the board presentation to everyone in the company. And we love it because, first of all, it signals that we trust everybody in the company, but it also lets everyone know what the heck's going on. So we don't have to spend a lot of time managing goals and telling people what to do where. They just kind of do it because they see what's important to the company. And we get 1 or 2 leaks a year, and when you leak, you get fired, because the way you get this kind of massive transparency in a company is by making it simple for people to keep track of what you can share and what you can't. And the rule of thumb is, when in doubt, you can't share it, right? And that keeps it simple. Now, in compensation, it's interesting because a lot of companies, there's a lot of tech companies, usually they have between 50 and 150 employees who say, well, let's make all our salaries transparent because people will be happier and we want to be a meritocracy. We choose not to do that for a couple reasons. One is that we've actually seen that being completely transparent about pay doesn't actually make people any happier. So if we took this entire room and took this gentleman, may I ask your name, sir? Ed. And Miss, may I ask your name? Chris. So, we were talking before, and he shared with me that Chris makes $1 million a year. $1 million a year, and all of you make less than that, right? And there's a bunch of you who make $999,000 and $950,000. Everyone except Chris is going to feel pretty bad, right? So what we found is that as soon as you get very transparent with pay, everyone except the top person is unhappy, and that person then habituates because they're like, well, I'm at the top. Like, where can I can't get any more here, I should leave. So what we do instead is we have a process that's very fair. There's this notion of distributive justice and procedural justice. Distributive justice is, are the outcomes fair? And the way to test that is you show everyone the information. We don't think that actually is helpful when it comes to compensation, not just because people get unhappy, but because there's also a lot of context, right? Like somebody might get an extra bigger bonus because they did some special project. If all you have is the number, everyone's going to look at it and say this is totally unfair, but they're not going to know that this extra stuff happened, right? So the distributive justice is really hard to get to when it comes to pay. But our employees generally believe our processes are fair and are okay with really wide outcomes because we have procedural justice. The way we set compensation is through a very fair process where it's a function of your performance rating. Your manager has input. There's an algorithm, like every company. There's a curve for your bonuses and equity and everything. So there's math and algorithm that says here's what it is. There's a budget people have to spend, and there's a set of reviews. There's another layer of management that reviews it. But importantly, our team, the people operations team, we take a look at it, and we run all kinds of statistical analyses to make sure people aren't skewing one way or another. We had for years an executive, we discovered this after I joined, she'd been systematically skimming. She had a large organization, very junior people, very senior people. She'd been skimming just a little bit, a few percentage points off the bonus pool for the junior people, because you take that away from like 1,000 people, and then you give it to 30 executives, it's a big, big number. So we stopped doing that, and then we told the company, hey, we found this thing, we stopped doing it. So because we have procedural justice, people are okay with us not having to verify the distributive justice. So that's how we approach it.
I wanted to know how you knew that Chris was making $1 million. But then I realized you're Google, you know everything. So with that, I'd like to transition to some questions that go beyond the book as well, if we could. And really, sort of the transitional question I want to ask is that, so leading companies in the new economy, including Google, have far fewer employees relative to market cap, relative to revenue, than the leaders of the industrial age, General Motors, U.S. Steel, that sort of thing. So the money is being concentrated in a smaller number of employees. So could a critic, perhaps with a somewhat Marxist bent, look at the advice that you're giving and the sort of extrapolation of Google's experience that you're offering, and say, you know, it just doesn't apply outside these companies that are doing so well at the leading edge of the new economy, and that in a sense, to sort of put an exclamation point at the end of it, that your advice amounts to Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake." That it just doesn't apply in more hard-scrabble parts of the economy.
Yeah, well, I'd say a couple things. It's a great question. Not at all Marxist. I think there's a couple things. One is markets in the short term can be massively inefficient, but over time, I mean, they tend towards efficiency. So, you know, it's rare to see companies have excess margins for like decades, right? So, you know, TBD how persistent that kind of stuff is. But, you know, I'm, of course, as an employee and shareholder, really pulling for it. But it's actually been really fascinating that you don't have to do this stuff at Google scale. And there's all kinds of companies that are doing very similar things. So, you know, if you're a company with much leaner margins, you know, at Google, we looked at the range of stock awards for employees. And we found at one level for a set of engineers, so one job level, 1 year, the non-zero minimum was a $10,000 stock award, and the maximum was actually $1 million, right? Huge variation. I do not recommend most companies have that wide variation. But in this case, you know, if somebody comes up with a tweak to our ad system, they could literally generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And that's a really big, valuable thing. So when you want to get that extreme, it's really important to have a clear link between the employee's contribution and what the outcome is. So you don't just sort of, you know, don't do profit sharing with your salespeople, right? Or revenue sharing with your salespeople, though they always ask for that. But what I found is that, you know, I mentioned Wegmans before, completely different business. They do a lot of these same things. There's a company called Brandix, which is a Sri Lankan textile company. And you think like developing market, textile manufacturing, like, you know, you think child labor, you think Rana Plaza, which was Bangladesh, remember the building that collapsed? And 1,100 people were killed. Textile workers, women and children largely, because management said you got to get in there and, you know, sew these T-shirts. Brandix, same industry, same part of the world, decided they want to take a different approach. So what they've done for years is largely female workforce, but they offer them classes on entrepreneurship, because the idea is eventually you're not going to be sewing things, you should do your own thing. They actually make management accessible to anyone, so you can reach out to their CEO and he will actually respond. They give these women money and they build wells in their home villages so that people can have clean water. And sure, there's some brand benefit, but the real reason, talking to them, the real reason they do it is they just say it's the right thing to do. They're now the second biggest exporter in Sri Lanka. They've won all kinds of awards for social responsibility, for treating people well, and it works for their profits. So there's cases that are completely different where it does seem to work. And the way to manage it in a different environment is, first, you have to have a fair process, this procedural justice that I was talking about that people agree are fair. And then second, you don't have to have 10x differentiation, but I guarantee in almost every company, there's not enough differentiation. And if you talk to your best people and your second best people, they'll say, you know, yeah, it just doesn't feel right, which is kind of an IQ test. Everyone says, you know, my pay's not high enough. But the way you fund it is you actually do scrape a little away from your B players and your C players. And they, therefore, will be a little more likely to leave. And that's OK, because they'll make room for more A players.
Thank you. Well, I want to stay with this sort of macroeconomic theme for a bit. So, so we have this situation where the leading leading companies in the new economy do have a smaller employment base than their predecessors. And we also have a situation which Google is very much in the forefront of, which is advancements in robotics and artificial intelligence, the driverless vehicle, for example. So there are a lot of people, obviously, who look ahead, maybe 50 years, maybe even less, and say, what in the world are people going to do for a living? There will be the generation of wealth at the top by the people who control the knowledge economy. But how will people, ordinary people, earn a living? Now, it's not Google's job to fix that, obviously. But is it something that's thought about inside the company as you look at something like the driverless vehicle and the potential employees rather, that could displace ultimately?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, and this will sound like a very Google answer, but I think one of the root causes of unemployment and underemployment is actually that we suffer from an information asymmetry problem. And what I mean by that is we all have a taxonomy of skills and capabilities, right? I say I'm good at HR, and somebody else may say they're good at HR, and we don't know if we're saying the same thing, right? And you don't actually know if I know what I'm talking about when I say that. And we have these horrible things called resumes, which don't capture who we are. And then we've got companies where they have lousy job postings because they're, Byzantine and written for legal protection purposes. And as we can talk about this if you wish, but we're actually all as human beings pretty bad at interviewing and assessing people. A lot of it is just snap judgment. So companies don't know what they're looking for. Interviewers don't know how to assess people. Candidates don't know how to explain what they want. None of us actually know what degree to get or what to study. And so if you're a welder in Detroit whose job is going away, you have no idea whether you should move to Louisiana and find new work as a welder, or whether you should go to nursing school and which nursing school you should go to and where you should go. If you were able to actually tell what people were getting what jobs, and you don't even have to know the people, you just need to know what types of folks, what kind of backgrounds are getting what jobs where, you actually could then start predicting okay, welder in Detroit, you should absolutely go to nursing school and then you should move to Atlanta. And by the way, this is the nursing program you should go to. Today we can't, but you'll always have frictional unemployment, but I think you can reduce this a lot. The second is, people were asking the same question 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. The iron horse is going to take jobs away, right? And I think we have the right professors in the room to correct my facts, because I'm not 100% sure on the dates, but 120 years ago or so, something like 95, 98% of the U.S. labor force was engaged in agriculture, mm-hmm. right? Farming and so on. And industrialization happened, and people said, what's going to happen? What's the next work? There is always going to be some other work. The real problem we have, the very real problem we have, and it's an inefficiency in capitalism, but it's logical that it's there, is that in the short term, there's massive concentration of wealth. Wealth, it turns out, also follows a power law distribution. And then eventually what seems to happen is the government steps in and regulates and redistributes, and or you have, I wouldn't recommend this, but historically the other option has been, you said let them eat cake. There was revolutionary France, right? So it gets corrected over time, but the problem is that leaves you a very real, to an economist, short-term problem, which is like 5 or 10 or 20 years where people don't know what they're doing and don't know how to make a living wage. The one nice thing that I'm seeing is large employers who are important more for their symbolic power than anything else in this regard are actually doing things to increase wages. So you all saw the announcements from Walmart, from McDonald's. It's a step, right? And we at Google have kind of done similar things. We haven't talked about it publicly. But the other thing we've been pushing on as a company is working in particular with our vendor partners to make sure not just wages make sense, but that benefits are accessible. Because often the big issue is not in terms of sort of, are you on the brink of financial collapse or not? It's part of it is, do you have enough money to make a living? But everybody has problems like tragedy in life, so we push really hard to make sure that our partners all provide really great benefits at a reasonable cost, so that, and for not just employees but for their dependents, and that's something I hope more companies will start doing.
Great. We had, a few months ago, we had former Secretary Geithner talking a lot about what happened in 2008 and the ongoing repercussions of that. Next week we have former Secretary Paulson to kind of bookend that. I wanted to ask you a couple questions, and it flows out of what you just said about government regulation and so on. So there's certainly a debate in the United States about Wall Street, broadly defined, the financial sector, and whether or not there is still a kind of relationship between success in Wall Street and on Wall Street and success on Main Street, or whether or not somehow the economy has broken that connection. Obviously, so Google and other companies like it are in significant ways creations of the financial of the ability to raise capital and to move forward economically in that way. Does the company have a position on the question of increased regulation of the financial sector, or not increasing regulation of the financial sector? And just sort of beyond that sort of specific question, the broader question of your view as somebody at the cutting edge of the economy as to whether or not the financial sector continues to be productive of quote unquote real wealth in the country, or is it something else as critics would describe?
Well, as a company, we don't have a position on it. Personally, I think it's. I remember I worked with somebody when I was at McKinsey & Company who said that the most clever thing that the banking industry ever did was set a fee structure that was based on percent of volume. So you do an M&A, you get 7%. And I remember him saying, he said two things. He said a lot of things that stayed with me. This gentleman, Rob Rosiello, who ran the office, fabulous guy. One was how clever that was to set, because consulting is an hourly business, right, or a daily or weekly. And he just always thought it was brilliant to be paid as a percent of deal size. The other thing he said was that the most valuable line ever uttered in the English language was, "Would you like fries with that?" So I'm afraid, I think your other guests will have I don't think it'd be hard to be more thoughtful on the topic than what I just said. But they may have a deeper perspective.
Thank you. I think it was in fact insightful. Want to talk about as you heard me say when Secretary Paulson comes, he's going to talk about China, and there's obviously a fascinating story of the history of Google in and out of China. So. Why today do many Chinese people Baidu things rather than Google things? How did that come to be?
Yeah, I think it was around 2008 or 2009. And actually I should say up front, we have engineers in China, we have salespeople in China, we do lots of very, very cool things in mainland China. And but we got to a point where we were being asked to censor our search results. And our initial response was, as was every search engine, and our initial response was, well, we'd rather not do that. And we were told, well, then, what you're doing is illegal. And these were results on the google.cn site. So there's google.com, there's google.uk. Every country has kind of their own, variation of it. So google.cn. And we were told, well, the law is you have to do this. And we said, well, okay, well, we had debates about it and said, well, we don't want to break the law. And so we'd get guidance and we would look at it. And what we started doing was on the bottom of our search results, we would add a result that basically said, these results have been filtered. These results have been censored. Because our thinking was, we're Google, we're big fans of making information free and freedom of speech and expression. And if you indicate that something has been censored, that is very helpful information. And in the whatever, 99.9% of other cases, you're actually giving really useful information. And then what happened after that was a number of other search engines started adding a similar disclaimer, which we thought was fantastic, progress, and helpful. Then we had some further conversations, and we ended up concluding that it didn't make sense at the time to keep doing that in China. And we had these huge debates, and this is where I had my epiphany about Hegelian dialectic at the company. And we decided that we were no longer going to host search results in China on the .cn domain. So we instead shifted to a .hk domain, which is Hong Kong, where there's protection for another, I think at this point, 46 or 45 years. And so we run results out of there, and that's kind of the position we've had. But the underlying debate was, is it better for us as a company, and kind of better for the world, to provide what information we can regardless of constraints, or to sort of not provide anything unless you go around the Great Firewall and use .hk or .com or what have you. And we at the time made the decision it was better just to not offer search results in country. But it was not an easy decision, and it still isn't, because there's 1.5 billion people in China who are good people, who are fantastic people. And it's not dissimilar from the debate we're having in our country today about Cuba. there's a lot of like good people there, including great people in government and different levels. And what's the right way, ethically right way, and best way to sort of be helpful and serve them and so on.
Debate between the power of engagement versus the need not to be an accomplice, right?
That's exactly right.
So, okay, I'd like to open up for questions from the audience. Please.
Curious, you have 50,000 Googlers around the world. How do you link goals?
I'm sorry, I apologize. I want to make sure everybody can hear. So we have two standing mics. If you wouldn't mind going to the mic.
I thought you were going to say, I'm sorry, I apologize. I was just kidding about the question.
Yeah, exactly.
No questions.
Exactly.
So knowing that you have all these Googlers around the world, and there are a lot of massive goals Google is aspiring to, how do you link execution, that is everybody's action plans, with the goals that are being accomplished with this HR process that you put in place, which is a bit unique?
Well, so what's really challenging at companies, once you get big, once you get more than a few hundred people, and you can get everyone in a room and just tell them, here's what we're doing, is that you can spend your entire year doing strategic planning and business planning. Or, I was at a company where it was a 6-month cycle, and as soon as one ended and you had your plan, I see heads nodding, right? Then you start planning again, and everyone's like, oh my God, can I just please sell something? And so we actually have a loosely coupled goal-setting process. It's called Objectives and Key Results. And Andy Grove, as far as I know, kind of came up with this. And John Doerr, who runs Kleiner Perkins and is on our board, he knew Andy. He brought it to Google in the very early days. So the idea behind objectives and key results, not rocket science. You have an objective, and then the key results are how you measure it. So for example, it's not enough to say, we want to grow search traffic by 30%, because if that's the objective, you can get a bunch of low-quality search traffic. You could spam a bunch of people with ads and have them click through. So it would be as measured by not just usage, but 7-day active usage, by quality of search results. You have all these other indicators that roll into it. So Larry Page sets annual OKRs for us, and he also sets each quarter new OKRs, refinements of kind of how we're going to get there. Everyone else in the company, everyone else, also sets quarterly OKRs and sometimes annual OKRs. But instead of waiting for Larry and then we run our process for the next 6 months, what happens is we all do it at the same time. And if you were just starting a company from scratch, it'd be a train wreck, right? Because we'd all be going different directions. Because it's an ongoing concern, what happens is Larry says, we need to be more focused on execution. And that quarter, a bunch of OKRs are already set, and people are kind of like, well, I was focused on quality and polish and finish and not getting things out the door. But they see it, so they refine their goals midstream. And then the second quarter, like 80 or 90% of the company gets it, and then 2 or 3 quarters in, everyone is completely in sync. The reason that works for us, though, is because all these goals are transparent to everyone in the company. So you can see Larry's, but you can see mine. You can see everybody else's, so you know what other people are doing. And number 2, because we don't tightly link these goals to compensation outcomes. We set really aggressive goals. Larry calls them moonshots. And the idea is if you're achieving like 60 or 70%, that's fantastic. On average, right? If all you ever do is 60%, that's a problem. But some you should blow out of the water, some not. And when it comes time to make compensation decisions, for example, the OKRs are an input, but we also look at the context. Did the market move? Did the economy turn down? Did some technology you were dependent on not get delivered? And that all accounts into it. So that loose coupling and the constant transparency makes it work actually really well.
I had a question to ask you about cultural and generational differences in the workforce in your company and how you address those differences in terms of expectations. And some of this arises in my mind because of a presentation we had earlier this week with Arianna Huffington in regards to their employee policies and practices and their attempts to accomplish in her company some balance between life and work. How does Google address that, and in particular from the perspective of cultural and generational differences of employees and expectations?
Yeah, well, what we find is, everyone talks about millennials. And what I've seen at Google, what we've seen, and the outside research is starting to bear out, is millennials actually aren't that different from the rest of us, right? Like they're more connected, they're more vocal, they communicate more. But what do they want? They want freedom, they want a great job, they want to have impact, they want to do cool things, right? And now that I'm over 40, I can look back at my 20-year-old self and think, oh, wait a minute, that's just what I wanted too. And so then I asked my dad, I said, Dad, what did you want when you were 20? And he said, well, I was living in communist Romania. So, but he wanted freedom, right? And if you ask yourselves, or ask your parents, what did they want? There weren't a lot of opportunities. There weren't the same kind of conversations, particularly if you were a woman, if you were African American, if you were Hispanic, if you were gay. But everybody, if you go back through the generations, they want their work to mean something. So the generational difference is interesting because we actually don't see that much of one, because the people who come to Google and we interact with, regardless of age, are kind of looking for the same thing. In terms of well-being and lifestyle, we did this study. We have a project called Google DNA, GDNA, which is inspired by the Framingham Heart Study, which some of you may be aware of. And it's set out to be a 100-year study of what actually makes people happy and productive and effective. And every 6 months, we survey Googlers, and it's totally opt-in on a bunch of different topics. So a year ago, we did a look at well-being, because the misnomer about work-life balance is like, oh, I shouldn't have to work. If I work more hours, I'm unhappy. And the reality is, if we all look back at our careers, there have been times when we worked nights and weekends and gone home and been totally energized, right? Been like, this is amazing. I really got something done. And there's also been times when you've worked like a half day. You kind of stagger in at 10, you blow off the day, you leave at 2:30 or 3, and you feel like your time's been wasted. So it's not related to the work. It's instead related to meaning. And then what we found in our research was there's people who are integrators and segmenters. And the short version of the answer is that there's some people who can just shut it off, and it doesn't bother them. And that's about a third of the people, at least at our company. They check their email at 11 o'clock, doesn't matter. They leave the office, doesn't matter. There's some people where it's all integrated. And for half of those people, which is about a third of our people, they hate that it's integrated. They feel like they always have to check. And so we teach them about how to shut things down. We did a thing in our Dublin office called Dublin Goes Dark, where basically there was someone with a cardboard box at the door when you left, and they said, please give me your computer. Please give me your phone. And everyone just turned them in. And the key was you have to have everyone do it at once, because otherwise some idiot's going to email you, right? And it was amazing. So there's ways to solve that, but it's not about the hours you work. It's about meaning and finding ways to actually disconnect and recharge.
Please.
I had a question about motivation and ownership in the workplace, and specifically about your non-engineering employees. How you differentiate between the people that feel that they are literally building the company with their hands and with their minds, as opposed to the people in the back house or what have you, and finding that same ownership in the health of the company.
That's a great question. So at Google, we always talk about we're an engineering company, engineering-focused company, and the effect that has is it kind of hurts everyone else's feelings, right? So 50% of the company are in technical areas, either engineering or product management. The other half are in sales and finance and people operations and public relations and so on. And so people in sales, when I joined, people in sales were already saying, oh, I don't feel as valued. But what was interesting was the ones who do online sales, so they're sort of behind, our small and medium business partners, who are behind screens all day interacting by email, they felt like they weren't as special as the ones who did large company sales, who actually get to go out of the office and meet with people. So you already had not just engineers versus other people, but sales versus sales. And because I sit in a position where I get to see the whole company, I'd go talk to the engineers. And in 2006, the people who were working on maps said, how come the search engineers are the favorites, right? And then we started building Android, and the search people came to me and said, how come Larry loves the Android engineers more than us? And what I realized is we're pack animals. We're human beings. We want to know who the lead dog is. We want to know where we are in the hierarchy. And so we actually spend a lot of time just telling people, like, look, Larry Page loves all his children equally. And when we look at happiness across the company in our annual surveys, we find there's not a huge difference. The engineers aren't necessarily happier. And we just do our best to treat everyone fairly. But it's a very human thing, and the biggest thing you can do is just tell people what you're feeling is normal. And it comes back to the comment about Villanova and where they rank in the MBAs. There's research that suggests you are going to be way happier being the top student at a state school than being the number 50 student at a place like Harvard or Stanford or what have you. And again, we're human beings. We always look for a reference group. But we always, because we're idiots, look for a reference group that's more accomplished than us. And that makes us unhappy. And so part of the conversation at Google is how do you have a reference group? How do you realize, actually, this is pretty amazing? And so we work at it.
early in the conversation, you mentioned your dissatisfaction with like the resume process and the interview process because it doesn't truly allow personality to show through. So, have you taken different like measures to kind of change the way that people express themselves in the application process, and has that changed the types of people that apply for your positions?
Yes, and it has. One example is, and there's some very cool stuff we're doing in this area that I can't yet talk about too much. But one thing we did was we years ago did a piece of work which we called Cerebro, which at the time only comic book dorks like me knew what it was. But now people have seen the X-Men movie, and it's some people. And I'll stick with the sports references maybe. But it's a machine used to find people with superpowers, right? And so what we found was we looked at 300 independent variables. Things like, when did you learn? Do you speak any foreign languages? If so, what? How many computer languages are you familiar with? Have you had a job early in your life? Do you have a dog? Do you have a cat? Because we figured dog people maybe are more team-oriented. And then we looked at, maybe. And then we looked at 25, what's that? We looked at 25 outcome variables, not just like your performance, but what's your velocity? How quickly are you moving through the company? Citizenship behaviors, like, do you do a lot of interviews? Do you host talks like this? And what we found was that for jobs with a large enough end count, we could actually generate 5 or 10 questions that would let us improve our ability to predict who to hire by a factor of anywhere between 5 and 30x what it had been. And what was interesting was some of the answers were different if you're a man or a woman. So for example, we'd ask on a scale of 1 to 5, how good a software engineer are you? And the answer for us to hire you if you're a man was a 4. Because we're team-oriented, and men tend to over-evaluate their capabilities. And so if a man says 5, he may be great, he may not. If he says 4, it's a signal of some self-awareness and team orientation. For a woman, the most predictive answer was a 5. Because there's so much societal pressure to be humble and self-effacing, and women on average, the research shows, aren't as likely to assert themselves and say, I'm awesome, I'm the best, until they're really certain they are. So if a woman says she's 5, she's going to be amazing, and women also, on average, are better at collaboration and things like that when they come from an engineering background. So very, very cool stuff, and more to come on that.
Mitch?
Thank you. On behalf of everybody, I want to say thank you for a great presentation today. A couple quick questions, and I come from the insurance industry with a major player there. I'm curious what you think of work at home, because we've been experimenting with work at home options. And the other part is I see you were at General Electric at one point. I'm curious with the kind of performance appraisal system that Jack Welch had there. We've kind of adopted some of that, and I'm just curious what you think of that kind of system.
Well, on the GE side, the GE sort of was infamous for the stack rank and force the bottom 10% out every year. If you're in a turnaround situation, that is a smart thing to do. If you're in cost-cutting mode, you got to get rid of people. You need some way to do it. In any other situation, my experience and what the research seems to suggest is that you're much better off focusing your people investment, your HR spend, on getting recruiting right up front and just not hiring those people. Eric Schmidt always used to tell me, your job is not to manage the poor performers. Your job is to make sure you never hire any poor performers. So that's kind of the best way to go. The other thing, there was a great Vanity Fair article written a while ago about Microsoft's use of the forced rank system, and they've since changed their system. But it talked about how you'd have teams come in, and you're on a team of 10, and no matter how everyone does, someone's going to be rated not performing. So if you're going to do a system like that, have a sufficiently large population, and don't apply that kind of distribution to a group of less than like 20 or 30 or 50 people. And forgive me, the first part of your question.
The work from home option.
The work from home. Personally, I'm a fan. Our approach as a company is we actually don't have a policy because we want to leave it up to the people to figure out with their team members, because it's not just the manager deciding or the company. Your team actually needs to be able to work with you too. But we actually, every year we take our best people managers, 20 best people managers. It's actually the biggest award you can win at Google is what we call it's got a very exciting name, the Great Manager Award. Because we innovate. And one of the people who won was a woman who had been working in, I think, Bristol, Connecticut, like somewhere between Mystic and New Haven, literally in the backwoods of Connecticut. And she'd been at Google 8 years, and she this last year, was one of our best people managers in the entire company. So there's definitely a way to do it. And you just need to make sure that people are committed and you're checking in.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Laszlo has to leave promptly, so I'm going to ask one quick last question. Just two housekeeping things. Any of you who have not finished lunch are free to stay. We don't have to break up with Laszlo's departure. And books will be available at the back of the room for any of you who haven't gotten your book, so we want to make sure everybody does. So last question real quick. Why people, operations, and not human resources?
So I asked myself the same question when I got the job. So when I was interviewing for Google, this was going to be, I've been at GE for 3 years. GE was kind of my first real HR job, and Google calls, and I figure I'm not going to get the job, and I'm interviewing, but it's for the head of HR for this company that 2 years post-IPO, right? There was Fortune at the time had run an article that said, is this company really worth $90 a share? So there was still a lot of ambiguity about, is this thing going to work? I was going to have to move from Connecticut, and so I'm interviewing for the head of human resources at Google. Then I get my offer letter. It says people operations. And I was like, oh, this isn't going to work. Because if this job doesn't work out, there's no way I'm going to be able to explain what the heck people operations is. So I call Google back. I'm like, you changed the title. Can we use the old one? And the person I was talking to said, you know what? The engineers won't respect you unless you have the word operations in your title. So why don't we do this? We'll give you 6 months. If you don't like it, you can change it back. By then, we'll have tricked the engineers. I said, okay. So I joined the company, and I go around meeting all the different senior people and critical people, and I meet this guy, Urs Holtzley. Urs, he'd had a startup. He was a professor at UC Santa Barbara. He's the guy who designed Google's data centers. He's the guy who basically figured out, how do I back up the internet, right? Like instantly all over the world. Brilliant, brilliant guy. Swiss, and I only mention that because he's incredibly precise and logical and direct, and he sort of confirms, and I love him, but he confirms every stereotype. And he had my resume, and he's looking at it and my current job title, and he looked at it and he said, oh, people operations. That's a great title. So I stuck with it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.